On one side, the overwhelming might of the German war machine. 5 divisions, panzers, and the full weight of the Wehrmacht, delivering a formal, almost polite demand for surrender. It was logical, professional, and on paper, inevitable. On the other, a surrounded, freezing, and desperately outnumbered band of American paratroopers. Their response was not a negotiation. It wasn't a plea or a counter-threat. It was a single, 4-letter word that defied all military logic, a word that would echo from the Ardennes into legend. This confrontation, however, was not born in a vacuum. It was forged in the crucible of Hitler's last desperate gamble in the West. By late 1944, the Allied armies were poised on the borders of Germany itself. The war, many believed, would be over by Christmas. But in the dense, snow-choked forests of the Ardennes, a storm was gathering. On the morning of December the 16th, under the cover of a brutal winter squall, over 250,000 German soldiers and more than 1,000 armored vehicles smashed into a thinly held American line. This was the Ardennes Offensive, known to the Allies as the Battle of the Bulge. The German objective was audacious, a lightning strike aimed at splitting the Allied forces and capturing the vital port of Antwerp. To achieve this, they had to move fast, and speed depended on one thing: roads. In the rugged, wooded terrain of the Ardennes, all major roads converged on a handful of key towns, and the most critical of these was a small, unassuming Belgian market town called Bastogne. It was the hub of a spiderweb of 7 major roads, the essential artery through which any armored thrust toward Antwerp had to pass. Whoever held Bastogne held the key to the entire German offensive. As the initial American defenses crumbled, a frantic call went out from the high command. They needed a fire brigade, a unit that could be thrown into the breach to hold the line at any cost. The call was answered by the 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles. These were elite veterans of Normandy and Holland, but they were in France, resting and refitting, utterly unprepared for a winter war. They were hurried onto trucks with little more than the ammunition in their rifles and the clothes on their backs, lacking winter gear, heavy weapons, and even adequate food. They drove for hours through the bitter cold, a convoy of defiance heading into a collapsing front. They passed shattered American units streaming in the opposite direction, their faces etched with the shock of defeat. Yet the paratroopers pushed on. They reached Bastogne just as the German armored spearheads of General Heinrich von Luttwitz's X-Sept Panzer Corps were closing in. The 101st, along with a hodgepodge of other units, formed a defensive perimeter around the town. The German tide, unable to break this island of resistance, simply flowed around it. By December 21st, the ring was sealed shut. The defenders of Bastogne were completely surrounded, outnumbered 5-1, and cut off from the world. Inside the pocket, the world shrank to the size of a foxhole. The strategic map, with its grand arrows and sweeping maneuvers, meant nothing to the man trying to keep his fingers from freezing to the steel of his rifle. Bastogne became a frozen island in a sea of gray German uniforms. The weather was more than an inconvenience. It was a relentless enemy. Temperatures plummeted far below freezing, and a thick, perpetual fog clung to the Ardennes, a damp shroud that muffled sound and chilled men to the bone. The paratroopers of the 101st, rushed from their barracks in France, were tragically ill-equipped. Many wore only standard field jackets over their uniforms, completely inadequate for the brutal Belgian winter. Frostbite became as great a threat as German patrols. Men wrapped their feet in burlap sacks, stuffed their jackets with straw, and huddled together for warmth, their breath crystallizing in the frigid air. The siege tightened its grip not only with cold, but with hunger. Rations were slashed, then slashed again. A day's meal might be a handful of cold crackers and a single spoonful of canned beans. Ammunition was counted out, round by precious round. Every shot had to count. In the makeshift aid station set up in the cellars of Bastogne, surgeons worked by lantern light with dwindling supplies of morphine and plasma. They used tablecloths for bandages and ran out of plaster for setting broken bones. The psychological pressure was immense. The Germans of the Panzer Division and other surrounding units never let up. They launched probing attacks day and night, testing the perimeter, looking for a weakness. The fog, while grounding the Allied air forces, also served as a perfect cloak for German infiltration. The nights were the worst, filled with the terrifying, unearthly shriek of the Naval-Werfer rockets, nicknamed Screaming Mimes by the GIs, and the sharp, distinctive crack of the dreaded German 88mm guns, firing directly into their positions. The sound of unseen tank treads grinding through the snow just beyond the tree line was a constant, nerve-shredding torment. It was a war fought blind. The soldiers could hear the enemy, smell the exhaust from their vehicles, but they could rarely see them until they were almost on top of them. Every shadow in the woods could be a German patrol, every snap of a frozen twig, an impending attack. Their world was a perimeter, a line drawn in the snow that could not be broken. For the men of the 101st, holding Bastogne was no longer a strategic objective. It was a simple, brutal matter of survival. They were alone, freezing and starving. Yet their defiance was hardening with every passing hour against the siege of steel and ice. In the heart of the besieged town, the American command post was a chaotic hub of strained nerves and dwindling hope. The division's commander, Major General Maxwell Taylor, was in the United States on a staff conference, a cruel twist of fate that left command in the hands of the division artillery commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe. McAuliffe was a capable, no-nonsense officer, but he now found himself thrust into one of the most desperate situations faced by an American general in the European theater. He was trying to orchestrate the defense of a town from all directions at once, with failing radio communications, and runners who were frequently shot trying to cross open ground. His maps showed the relentless pressure, the red arrows of German units, pushing in from every point on the compass. He knew his men were freezing and low on everything, and he knew that beyond the fog-choked skies, there was no immediate help coming. For the German commander, General Heinrich von Luttwitz, Bastogne was not just a target. It was an infuriating roadblock. His XL-Feuilles Panzer Corps was the armored fist of the offensive, designed to punch through to the Meuse River and beyond. But his panzers were now bogged down, their engines consuming precious fuel while sitting idle on icy roads. Every hour the Americans held Bastogne was another hour lost from the German timetable. The element of surprise, the very soul of the blitzkrieg strategy, was bleeding away into the snows of the Ardennes. Von Luttwitz looked at his own maps and saw a trapped enemy, outnumbered, outgunned, and with no hope of reinforcement. From a purely military standpoint, their position was hopeless. He decided that a costly, street-by-street battle for the town was an unnecessary waste of time and manpower. A more elegant and far quicker solution would be to simply demand their surrender. It was a logical move, rooted in the belief that the Americans, being rational soldiers, would see the futility of their situation and capitulate. On the morning of December 22nd, 4 German soldiers, 2 officers, and 2 enlisted men approached the American line south of Bastogne. They carried a large white flag of truce. The appearance of the enemy walking calmly toward their positions was a surreal sight for the weary GIs of the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment manning that sector. A ceasefire was called in the immediate area. The American soldiers, wary and suspicious, took the German delegation into custody. Blindfolded, the German officers were loaded onto a jeep and driven through the battered streets to the command post of Colonel Joseph Harper, the regimental commander. They carried with them a formal, typed document. It was a surrender ultimatum, a meticulously worded piece of psychological warfare designed to break the American spirit and deliver Bastogne into German hands without firing another shot. The fate of thousands of men now hinged on the contents of that single piece of paper. The German ultimatum was brought to General McAuliffe as he was visiting the front lines, a quick stopover to bolster the morale of his exhausted men. When he returned to his command post, in the Heinz barracks, the message was waiting. The document was formal, almost courteous in its tone, yet its underlying threat was unmistakable. It began by appealing to the well-known American humanity, noting the heavy civilian casualties that would result from further fighting. It detailed the overwhelming force surrounding Bastogne, multiple German artillery battalions and 6 heavy panzer battalions, all supposedly ready to unleash a storm of fire upon the town. The Americans, it stated, had one choice: a glorious surrender or total annihilation. The German commander magnanimously offered a 2-hour window for the Americans to consider their options. If they did not surrender within that time, the entire force of German artillery would open up, promising to reduce Bastogne to rubble. When McAuliffe first read the message, his reaction was not one of fear or contemplation, but of sheer disbelief and anger. He reportedly laughed and said, "A surrender? Aw, nuts." He initially tossed the paper aside, intending to ignore the German demand completely. He saw it for what it was, a bluff. He knew his men were in a dire situation, but he also knew the German timetable was tight. A prolonged artillery bombardment was a luxury they likely couldn't afford. It was his operations officer, Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kinnard, who pointed out that a formal ultimatum required a formal reply. Simply ignoring it would be a breach of military etiquette and might be misinterpreted. The staff officers gathered around McAuliffe in the cold, damp cellar began to brainstorm. What would be the appropriate response? A long, defiant declaration. A statement about fighting to the last man. Every suggestion seemed too verbose, too dramatic, and ultimately not quite right for the spirit of the men in the foxholes. They needed a reply that was as tough, as stubborn, and as unapologetically American as the paratroopers holding the line. McAuliffe, frustrated with the complex suggestions, kept coming back to his initial, visceral reaction. He turned to the officers and said, "Well, I don't know what to tell them." He then reflected for a moment and concluded, "That first remark of mine would be hard to beat." The room fell silent, and then a consensus grew. It was perfect. It was concise, contemptuous, and utterly unambiguous in its sentiment, even if the Germans wouldn't understand the literal meaning. A secretary was summoned, and a single sheet of paper was placed in the typewriter. McAuliffe dictated the official reply of the 101st Airborne Division to the German demand for surrender. The message to the German commander, typed neatly in the center of the page, contained only one word: the task of delivering this unique piece of military correspondence fell to Colonel Joseph Harper, the commander of the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment. He drove back to the front lines where the German delegation was being held, the typed reply tucked securely in his pocket. The 2 German officers, a major and a captain, were waiting impatiently, their blindfolds removed. They had been given coffee and cigarettes, a small gesture of professional courtesy in the midst of a brutal siege. They clearly expected to be returning with terms of surrender, the final details of a rational capitulation. Colonel Harper approached them, the single sheet of paper in his hand. He presented it to the German major. The officer unfolded it and stared at the centered text. It read, "To the German commander. Nuts. The American commander." Now, the German officer's face was a mask of confusion. He looked from the paper to Harper and back again. "Is this a negative or an affirmative reply?" he asked in English. The captain beside him was equally bewildered. He asked, "What does this mean? Are you surrendering?" They were professional soldiers, accustomed to the rigid protocols of warfare, and this single slang word fell completely outside their experience. They tried to understand if it was some kind of coded American message, a clever diplomatic maneuver they were failing to grasp. Harper, enjoying the moment of psychological victory, knew he had to translate the sentiment, if not the word itself. He looked the German officers squarely in the eye. "The reply is decidedly not affirmative," he explained. "In plain English, it means the same as go to hell." The reality of the situation finally dawned on the German delegation. This was not a negotiation. It was a categorical, almost insulting rejection of their power. There would be no glorious surrender. There would only be a fight. Harper added a final, chilling remark. "And I will tell you something else," he said. "If you continue to attack, we will kill every goddamn German that tries to break into the city." The German officers, their mission a complete failure, were escorted back to their lines. They carried with them not a surrender agreement, but a message of pure, unadulterated American defiance. The story of the reply spread through the American lines like wildfire. Runners carried the news from one frozen command post to the next. The word nuts was passed down from platoon sergeants to the men huddled in their foxholes. The effect on morale was electric. In a situation defined by cold, hunger, and overwhelming odds, this single word was a shot of adrenaline. It was a sign that their leadership was not considering surrender, that they were as stubborn and unwilling to break as the men on the line. It was a joke shared in the face of annihilation, a moment of gallows humor that solidified their resolve. They were the battered bastards of Bastogne, and they were not going anywhere. For the German command, the American reply was more than just an insult. It was a profound miscalculation on their part. General von Lüttwitz had believed he was engaging in psychological warfare, using the threat of annihilation to break his opponent's will. He had assumed the American commander would be a pragmatist, a man who could read a map and understand the hopelessness of his position. The nuts response completely upended that assumption. It revealed an enemy that was not operating by the cold logic of military science, but by an intangible, irrational stubbornness. The Germans were perplexed. Was this arrogance, stupidity, or was it a bluff, a sign that the Americans had some hidden ace up their sleeve? Perhaps a relief column that was closer than German intelligence believed. This uncertainty sowed a seed of doubt in the German ranks. Their bluff had been called. They had promised total annihilation by massed artillery, but now they had to deliver. The problem was, the overwhelming artillery force mentioned in the ultimatum was largely a fabrication. While they had significant firepower, it was dispersed along a wide front, not concentrated in a ring of steel around Bastogne, ready to obliterate the town in a single, earth-shattering barrage. Von Lüttwitz now had to make good on his threat with the forces he actually had. The fighting for Bastogne intensified dramatically. The Germans, stung by the rejection of their ultimatum, launched a series of furious, determined assaults on the American perimeter. They threw infantry and armor against the thinly held lines, particularly on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day, hoping to break the defenders before any relief could arrive. The battles for the small villages on the outskirts of Bastogne, places like Marvy, Noville, and Foy, became desperate, close-quarters struggles. American paratroopers, their ammunition critically low, waited until the German tanks were almost on top of their foxholes before firing their bazookas. They fought with bayonets and trench knives in the frozen woods. Every inch of ground was paid for dearly. Inside the town, the defenders braced for the promised artillery apocalypse. The shelling did increase, and German bombs fell on the town square, but the all-out, city-leveling bombardment never materialized. The American defiance had forced the Germans to commit to a bloody, grinding battle of attrition, exactly the kind of fight their offensive timetable could not afford. While the paratroopers were holding the line, another critical battle was being fought far above them. It was a battle against the weather. For days, the Ardennes had been locked under a thick blanket of low clouds and fog. This weather had been the Germans' greatest ally, grounding the overwhelmingly superior Allied air forces. Without air support, the defenders of Bastogne were blind and isolated. But in the pre-dawn hours of December 23rd, a miracle occurred. The winds shifted, and the temperature dropped even further. Soldiers awoke to find the sky was a brilliant, cloudless, and painfully cold blue. The siege of the fog was broken. The sight of a clear sky over Bastogne was like an answered prayer. For the first time in nearly a week, the beleaguered defenders heard a sound more welcome than any Christmas carol: the drone of friendly aircraft engines. The air was suddenly filled with hundreds of American C-47 transport planes, their silver fuselages glinting in the winter sun. They flew in low, brave formations, braving German anti-aircraft fire to deliver the lifeblood of the defense. K-rations, medical supplies, batteries for the radios, and most importantly, ammunition, rained down from the heavens on colorful parachutes. Men who had been down to their last handful of cartridges now had their bandoliers refilled. Surgeons in the aid stations now had plasma and morphine to treat the wounded. The supply drop was a massive logistical triumph and a staggering blow to German morale. The surrounded garrison was no longer truly isolated. But the C-47s were not the only angels in the sky that day. With the clearing weather came the hunters. Squadrons of P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bombers, nicknamed Jugs by their pilots, swarmed over the Ardennes. These heavily armed aircraft were the tankers' worst nightmare. For days, the German panzer divisions had operated with impunity under the cover of the fog. Now they were exposed and vulnerable. The Thunderbolts, armed with rockets, bombs, and 850 caliber machine guns, went to work with brutal efficiency. They strafed German supply columns, turning trucks into flaming wrecks and blocking the vital roads. They hunted German armor in the forests, diving on unsuspecting tanks and artillery positions. The balance of power around Bastogne shifted in a matter of hours. The hunters had become the hunted. The psychological impact on the German soldiers was devastating. They were now the ones who had to cower in their foxholes, scanning the skies in terror. The feeling of invincibility that had propelled their initial advance was shattered by the roar of the Thunderbolt's engines. While the air was being contested, a race against time was unfolding on the ground. To the south, General George S. Patton, commander of the United States Third Army, had performed one of the most astonishing logistical feats of the war. Upon hearing of the German offensive, he had famously promised the Allied High Command that he could disengage his army from its current front, turn it 90 degrees to the north, and attack the southern flank of the German Bulge within 48 hours. It was a seemingly impossible boast, yet through sheer force of will, Patton made it happen. Entire divisions were pulled from the line and sent racing north over icy, treacherous roads. The spearhead of this relief effort was the 4th Armored Division, a hard-fighting, veteran unit tasked with one mission: break through to Bastogne. They faced entrenched German resistance, minefields and ambushes, fighting for every village and crossroads in their path. The fate of the men in Bastogne now depended on whether Patton's tanks could break the German ring before the 101st Airborne's newfound supplies ran out. The advance of the 4th Armored Division was a brutal, inch-by-inch grind. The same clear weather that allowed Allied air power to dominate the skies also gave German anti-tank gunners perfect visibility. The landscape south of Bastogne was a killing ground, dotted with snow-covered hills and dense woods that provided perfect cover for ambush. Patton's tankers and armored infantry faced a determined, well-entrenched enemy who knew that if the ring around Bastogne was broken, the entire German offensive could unravel. The battle for every small village became a vicious firefight. German 88mm guns, camouflaged in barns or along tree lines, picked off American Sherman tanks at long range. Panzerfaust anti-tank rockets, fired by hidden infantrymen, turned the narrow village streets into death traps. The relief column pushed forward, leaving a trail of burning vehicles and frozen casualties in its wake. The pressure on Patton was immense, not just from the enemy, but from the Allied command, who watched the drama of Bastogne unfold with bated breath. Inside the besieged town, the defenders of the 101st could hear the distant rumble of the fighting. It was the sound of hope, a constant reminder that they were not forgotten. Bolstered by the aerial resupply, they fought with renewed ferocity. McAuliffe's "nuts" reply was no longer just a defiant gesture. It had become a promise they had to keep. They had told the Germans they would hold, and now they had to prove it. The German commanders, seeing their window of opportunity closing, threw everything they had left at the town on Christmas Day. It was a final, desperate attempt to crush the garrison before Patton's forces could arrive. The fighting was particularly savage around the village of Marvy on the southeastern perimeter. German panzers and infantry penetrated the American lines, and the fighting devolved into a chaotic brawl in the darkness. Paratroopers used bazookas at point-blank range and fought hand-to-hand in the shattered houses. The line bent, but it did not break. By the afternoon of December 26th, the lead elements of the 4th Armored Division, specifically a column from Combat Command R led by Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, were on the outskirts of the village of Assenois, just a few miles from the Bastogne perimeter. They had fought their way through hell to get there. Now only one last stretch of German-held territory separated them from their objective. Abrams ordered a final, desperate charge. Tanks and half-tracks, with infantry clinging to their sides, blasted their way through the German defenses. It was a high-risk gamble, a full-throttle assault that relied on speed and shock to overwhelm the enemy. The lead tank broke through the German lines, followed by the rest of the column. A short time later, they rolled into the American perimeter, making contact with the paratroopers of the 326th Engineer Battalion. The siege of Bastogne was broken. The link-up was not a grand cinematic moment with cheering crowds and formal ceremonies. It was a gritty, exhausted meeting of two battle-weary forces. The tankers of the 4th Armored were grimy and spent from their relentless drive north, their vehicles scarred by days of constant combat. The paratroopers of the 101st who greeted them were gaunt, frostbitten figures in ragged uniforms, their eyes hollowed out by a week of sleepless vigilance. There was a brief, profound handshake in the fading winter light, a moment of shared understanding between soldiers who had faced the abyss and survived. The relief of Bastogne did not end the battle, but it marked the beginning of the end for the German Ardennes Offensive. The town had been the linchpin of their entire plan. By holding it, the Screaming Eagles had denied the Germans the crucial road network they needed for a rapid advance. They had acted as a breakwater, disrupting the flow of the German tide and forcing the panzer divisions to waste precious time and fuel in costly detours on inadequate secondary roads. This delay was fatal. It gave the Allied High Command the time it needed to stabilize the front, shift reserves, and organize a powerful counterattack. Patton's Third Army, striking from the south, was only one half of the pincer. Other American and British forces were already beginning to press down from the north, squeezing the German Bulge. The strategic significance of the stand at Bastogne was immense. It turned what could have been a decisive German breakthrough into a battle of attrition, a fight the Germans, with their dwindling resources, could not possibly win. But the legacy of Bastogne transcends mere strategic analysis. It became a powerful symbol of American resilience and determination. In the darkest days of the Battle of the Bulge, when the Allied front was reeling and the specter of a major defeat loomed large, the story of the surrounded garrison and their defiant, one-word reply provided a much-needed psychological victory. It was a story of underdog courage that captured the imagination of the Allied world. General McAuliffe's simple, blunt response became legendary. It perfectly encapsulated the spirit of the American GI, informal, unimpressed by authority, and possessing a stubborn refusal to quit, no matter the odds. It was not a quote from a military textbook or a line from a polished speech. It was authentic and raw, a reflection of the national character in a moment of extreme crisis. The defense of the town was a testament to the individual soldier, the paratrooper in his frozen foxhole, conserving his last 3 rounds of ammunition, the medic working on wounded comrades in a freezing cellar, the glider infantryman facing down a tank with a bazooka. It was their collective courage, their refusal to break, that truly held Bastogne. They had been outnumbered, outgunned, and surrounded, but they had never been defeated. Years after the snows of 1944 melted from the fields around Bastogne, the story of the siege endures as a defining chapter of the Second World War. The Battle of the Bulge would rage for another month, becoming the largest and bloodiest single battle fought by the United States in the conflict. But the successful defense of this small Belgian town was the battle's crucial turning point. It was here that the momentum of Hitler's last great offensive was irrevocably broken. The German army bled its last reserves of armor, fuel, and elite manpower into the Ardennes snow, losses from which it would never recover. The road to victory for the Allies was now clear, though it would still be paved with sacrifice. For the men of the 101st Airborne Division, Bastogne became their finest hour. They would forever be known as the battered bastards of Bastogne, a name they wore with pride. Their stand earned them the first ever Presidential Distinguished Unit citation awarded to an entire division, a testament to their extraordinary heroism. The individuals involved became icons of the war. General Anthony McAuliffe, the accidental commander, was immortalized for his unflappable demeanor and his perfectly chosen word. General Patton's audacious 90-degree turn and relief of the town solidified his reputation as one of America's most dynamic and aggressive battlefield commanders. The battle also served as a stark reminder of the brutal realities of war. The human cost was staggering. Thousands of men, both American and German, became casualties in the fight for this one crossroads town. The civilians of Bastogne, caught in the crossfire, suffered immensely, their homes reduced to rubble in the shelling and bombing. The legacy of Bastogne is ultimately a story of how a seemingly hopeless situation was overcome not by superior technology or grand strategy alone, but by the sheer indomitable will of the human spirit. It demonstrates how a single word, born of frustration and defiance, can become a rallying cry more powerful than any weapon. It is a story of how a small group of freezing, hungry soldiers, armed with little more than their courage and a shared sense of duty, could stand against a mighty army and, by refusing to yield, change the course of a world war. Their echo is not just in the pages of history books, but in the quiet woods of the Ardennes, a permanent testament to the extraordinary fortitude of the ordinary soldier.